Football sex abuse scandal reaches 350 complainants. Manchester police alone are investigating 10 suspects. Good evening. The sexual abuse scandal enveloping British football is already on a huge scale and rising by the day. 100 more cases today, and new names of suspects surfacing with them. Nobody yet knows the true extent of it, but already the sport will be forced to review the safeguarding of young footballers when they come under the control of adult coaches. Tonight, the latest.
Also tonight, as the latest immigration figures reveal another record high, does the government have a plan on how to get them down? Boris Johnson denies telling European ambassadors that personally he was in favour of keeping freedom of movement.
Immigration had been a good thing for the UK in many respects, but it had got out of control, and that we needed to take back control. I think you will find the record reflects.
You either have dangerous levels of pollution cause a series of air quality alerts in London, as a new report calls for changes to roads, speed bumps and cars to cut emissions. And as the Syrian government forces advance into East Aleppo, there are fears for hundreds of men being arrested as terror suspects.
And we meet Phoebe Waller-Bridge, the writer and star of the dark and filthy comedy hit Fleabag.
Oh my God, definitely not. That does nothing for you. What?
These are my clothes, Boo. I've been wearing these all day.
It's really not that bad. It's really not that bad.
After TV success here and in America, she's taking it back to where it began, the theatre.
It came at a time in my life when I was feeling quite inexplicably ragey, and I wanted to write a female character that was inexplicably ragey as well.
Now, already 350 people have been reporting alleged cases of child sex abuse connected to football clubs. The number has been rising by the day following the launch of an NSPCC hotline, which has received more than 860 calls in its first week of operation. Greater Manchester Police alone say they've received reports from 35 individuals and have identified 10 suspects. And as the numbers rise, Channel 4 News tonight names another football coach who victims say may have abused dozens of young boys. Our sports correspondent, Kamian Zerum, has this.
Now Channel 4 News can name the man victims say abused them. Football coach and now named by victims as a child sex abuser, Frank Roper. Here on tour with a team of young boys. Last night, for the first time, victims revealed that an unnamed coach abused young boys in the Blackpool area for years. But Roper took his secret to his grave. It means for his victims and their families, it's not the closure they were hoping for.
He took my childhood away, and he's taken away a big part of my life. I'm determined not to let him, dead or alive, take away any more of my life. My wife and children were probably more disappointed than me because, you know, they were angry, bearing in mind that they only knew the extent of what happened to me over the last couple of weeks. So they wanted revenge, I would say, or retribution. So, you know, it devastated them more than me.
And in the Northwest, victims have told us that they believe their abusers were working together in youth football to target victims. Paul Stewart says Roper justified his own behaviour by telling him he knew another coach did the same thing.
Yeah, that was more or less what he was trying to say, you know, and how matter of factly he said it, you know, when I look back, just disgusts me.
This is a scandal that's affecting everyone in football. Paul Stewart used to play at Crystal Palace with a youngster called Gareth Southgate. Stewart confirming to Channel 4 News he is the man the New England manager, unveiled today, spoke of in his very first press conference.
You know, I played with one of the players who's recently come forward, and the reality of that, as they have said, is that they haven't felt able to speak about that until this moment, and that's completely understandable.
Channel 4 News has been told of 2 men Roper's said to have abused who've yet to come forward, and at least another 30 who've personally told this victim that Roper abused them too. Jason Dunford says, please, if you can, speak out.
We got through the worst of this, and now it's important that for future generations of our children and your children, that we now come up with a preventive message, and we come up with preventive methods to stop the future generations having to go through what we went through.
This is now surely the biggest investigation into historical child sex abuse this nation has ever seen. In all, 17 police forces are now looking into allegations. They've received 350 reports to date, and the NSPCC hotline, set up a week ago, has received 860 calls, more than the one for Jimmy Savile.
We're coping okay with the numbers that are coming through, but it is unprecedented, and we have been staggered, frankly, at the volume of calls, concerns that have come through.
Where does it end? In Newcastle, another victim of convicted paedophile George Ormond spoke today on how being abused destroyed him.
You know, when I first signed for Newcastle, I was unstoppable. I was, you know, fully filled with confidence, and from that moment, you know, it left a big kind of space, you know, for me to feel really low confidence. So yeah, it was a horrific moment.
And the impact on these grown men who bottled up what happened in locker rooms and showers for decades is still untold.
I've suffered enough. I want to move forward. People are asking me, has this helped? I don't know yet. I'm 2 weeks down the line. I haven't yet been out in public, if I'm honest. So, you know, I've got to get back to some normality.
But what is normal when no one knows how many more of these terrible secrets football still hides?
Cayman Zaram. In a moment, we'll talk to presenter and journalist Charlie Webster, who was abused by her running coach when she was 15. But first, from Norwich, we're joined by Chief Constable Simon Bailey, who is the lead for child protection on the National Police Chiefs Council. And Simon Bailey, I'm wondering, do you have really any sense of how big a task you've got ahead of you?
Well, I think we can see from the numbers that are already in the public domain that we have a really significant task ahead of us. We are already looking at 350 potential victims, and I suspect that those numbers will increase, and I would certainly encourage any victims that have yet to have the confidence and courage to come forward to look at the numbers of people that are coming forward and follow their lead. I think it's really important that we understand the true scale of the challenge that we are dealing with, but most importantly, we ensure that the people that have been abusing them are no longer in a position to be able to carry on that abuse.
Well, I mean, Manchester police are saying they've got 10 suspects they're looking very closely at already. Do you have any sense of that kind of a number?
No, and I think those numbers will increase. There are, as you know, 17 forces. It involves 55 football clubs, ranging from both the professional clubs and the Premiership right down to amateur grassroots clubs. So in the first few days, we've seen incredible numbers of reports coming through, both to the police service, to clubs themselves, and to the Football Association, NSPCC hotline. And I suspect that those numbers will continue to grow in the next few days and weeks.
This is sensitive and difficult work, and I mean, you yourself are somebody who knew about child protection before, but there are going to be officers having to deal with this who have not really been in this sort of work before, because it's surely beyond the scale of what you're really equipped to deal with.
Well, through Operation Hydrant, which is the National Police Chiefs Council's coordinating body, we will be coordinating the approach across the police service to this. We will be deconflicting investigations, and we will certainly be making sure that senior investigating officers across the country are provided with the appropriate support. Their first thoughts and focus is going to be on ensuring the safeguarding arrangements are in place to make sure that abusers can no longer abuse, and they will then be prioritising investigations to make sure that victims get the right outcomes. We are obviously dealing with a number of years. In some cases, I suspect that abusers will already be serving custodial sentences. Some may well be dead. So there will be a sense of prioritisation and coordination across the service, and certainly through Operation Hydrant, I believe we are well placed to do this. We have specialist officers who are trained to be able to deal with these investigations and will listen very sympathetically, very carefully to all allegations of abuse. And I would certainly encourage all victims to have the confidence and courage to come forward.
Chief Constable, if you could stay with us for a moment. Let me turn then to you, Charlie Webster. you were not abused as a footballer, you were abused as a runner. And I think your point really is that this is time not just to stop at football, but to look at the relationships in sport generally between coaches and young people.
I think even further than that, John, because I think we've reported that it's a big problem for football. It's not a problem for football, and it's not really a problem for sport. It's a problem which transcends all of sport. Yes, I was abused in running. The incredible courage of the footballers coming forward were abused in football. But it's not just a coach, it's a position of power against somebody who's vulnerable, which is why it tends to be children. And it happens in institutions where that's able, where there's power and where there's vulnerability. So not just in sport, running, football, it happens, we've heard in churches, in teaching, in any position where there is that relationship. And it's really important that we understand what sexual abuse is, because sexual abuse can happen to anybody. It can happen to a male or female. It's exactly the same act. And it's manipulative, it's cold, it's calculated. And the person who is the perpetrator doesn't show this thing on their forehead where they're this creep or weirdo. They tend to be very nice to the outward public, and they tend to be sometimes put on pedestals, especially coaches, especially in grassroots sport. My coach was seen as somebody who was pivotal to our community, and he was helping young girls achieve their dreams. And I'm sure a lot of the coaches which have been abusing the footballers, it's the same thing. They're seen as, you know, these amazing people which are really helping young people achieve their dream. And
this clearly has to be a watershed for society at large, precisely for the reasons you spell out. But the question is, you've really got 2 points. One is to bring people to being able to talk about it and tell what actually happened to them, to the police and to the NSPCC. But the other is what you do after that. I mean, do you now have to think in terms of chaperones and all sorts of other resources to safeguard children in these circumstances?
I think that, you know, there are so many different things. I think, firstly, you're right. I mean, I've been talking about this for a long time now. I waived my anonymity 2 years ago, but even before that, I was campaigning. I was working with victims in SARC centres, sexual abuse rape centres, and I think it's amazing that these victims have come out, because it will maybe change the conversation once and for all, that it happens to both sexes, which I think is very important. It's not gender specific, and also that it's a wide societal problem that's actually disgusting and horrendous. And while we kind of turn a blind eye to it, we're covering it up. You know, the society is just as bad because we're covering it up and ignoring it. So I think, again, the definition of what it actually is really important, because I remember somebody saying to me, well, shouldn't the parents look out for them? And it's like, well, I didn't walk home and there was no signs of me. I probably covered it up. I didn't walk in the room as kind of like crying my eyes out. And also, I didn't really know what's happened. So I think education is pivotal to it, not just safeguarding and not looking internally at football clubs or the FA or governing bodies. It can't be an internal investigation. It's got to be something outward. And we have to learn from historical abuse. You know, we've seen Jimmy Savile, we've seen the football cases now, and we need to create a safe forum for victims to come forward and feel confident to, without being vilified themselves.
Well, Chief Constable, I mean, the problem, of course, is that we already have a child abuse investigation going on into historic cases anyway, and that has been terribly fraught with difficulties. Are you confident that this could be a moment when the police will be able to, in some way, to crack this and leave us in a situation where perhaps we can deal with this much more effectively in the future?
Well, I'm very confident around the police service's response to this, and there is no doubt it has got better over the last few years. And I think that is amply demonstrated by the fact that more victims are having the confidence to come forward. But I'd really like to pick up on the point that Charlie's made in terms of how we as a society build resilience amongst children and young people, so that they understand when they are potentially subject to exploitative relationships or as somebody's trying to abuse them. And the fact is that by the time a victim has the confidence and courage to come forward and report their abuse to us, it's too late and the damage has been done. And society, we have now got to start reflecting upon all non-recent abuse across all institutions, be it within the church, within education, within care homes, within football or in any other environment, and say, how do we go about preventing this in the future? And my view is that by creating resilient children, resilient young people that understand where they are being abused and potentially being exploited is perhaps the greatest significant step that we could take towards achieving that aim.
Chief Constable Simon Bailey, thank you very much for joining us. And Charlie Webster, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Christian.
Well, and precisely on the points made in that discussion, later on tonight's programme, allegations of abuse in another sector of society. We talked to a French woman who says she was raped at 13 by a British glamour photographer who specialised in nude images of young girls.
He's a pedophile. He raped a lot of little girls.
Immigration has hit another new record. A total of 650,000 people arrived in Britain in the year ending June the 30th. Even when those leaving the country were taken into account, the net migration figures were still at near record levels. For the first time, Romanians were the biggest single group of new arrivals. Paul McNamara has spent the day in Burnt Oak in northwest London, an area that's been tagged Little Romania. He has this report.
New Year's Day 2014. And a new dawn for arrivals from Romania. Working restrictions lifted, and Victor Spirescu is first off the plane.
It's the first day you open the border to work the people.
And what are your plans today now?
To work, I go on to wash car.
But how many more would join Victor? And how would their arrival sit with this pledge by the then Home Secretary?
It is the position. I listen very carefully. I will say this only once. We aim to reduce net migration from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands by the end of this Parliament.
6 years on, and immigration is still in the hundreds of thousands.
This pocket of North London is known as Little Romania. The second most common language spoke here is Romanian. There are Romanian cafes, Romanian supermarkets, and according to the latest figures, Little Romania is having a growth spurt. Just under 10% of all immigrants to the UK are now from Romania.
In fact, for the first time, more people come to the UK from Romania than anywhere else in the world. But the statistics released today only go as far as the end of June, and the manager of this Romanian restaurant thinks the numbers are set for a sharp decline.
After the Brexit, a lot of people, they just went back.
Really?
Yeah. I had a lot of friends which they went back to Germany, for example, or France.
So how far is Theresa May from her target of tens of thousands of migrants? Well, in the 12 months to June this year, the number of people moving to the UK from abroad has risen to a record 650,000 people. The all-important net migration figure, that's immigration minus emigration, still stands at near record levels of 335,000. And net migration from the EU, a major concern of Brexiters, is higher than ever at 189,000. The Foreign Secretary reportedly told a room of diplomats this week that he had no problem with freedom of movement, although he was more guarded when cornered by a gaggle of journalists.
I've been a long-standing supporter of immigration, and what I said very clearly to that group of ambassadors, I think it was at a breakfast, was that immigration had been a good thing for the UK in many respects, but it had got out of control, and that we needed to take back control.
So nearly 3 years since Victor's early morning arrival. What became of him? Is he still washing cars? We tracked him down to West London.
I have a bad beginning, you know, but slowly I grow up myself.
You seem to be doing quite well now.
Yeah, now it's okay. Now, what can I say? I have my own LTD. I have few guys to work straight away for me. I make good money. I'm like a supervisor.
You happy?
Yeah, for sure. Why not?
Well, a little light has been shed today on the government's have cake and eat it approach to Brexit negotiations. But it looks like we may have to pay for it first. The Brexit Secretary David Davis suggested to MPs today that ministers might be prepared to continue contributions to the EU to maintain access to the single market. Our political editor Gary Gibbon is in Westminster. Gary.
Well, one thing you'll probably remember from the referendum campaign, if anything, is that we're net contributors to the EU. We pay a sort of subscription, that disputed figure of 350 million a week on the side of the Leave bus. What you didn't hear during the referendum was the idea that we might carry on paying even if we come out, and potentially quite a chunky amount. But that's what behind the scenes David Davis, the Secretary of State for exiting the EU, has been saying to business people who've been in to visit him, his rationale is that that might be the only way in which we secure the sort of single market access that we get for a lot of our exporters at the moment inside Europe. He's been saying that to them privately. Today, when he was asked by a Labour MP in the House, he was a bit more open in public. And this is what he said when he was asked, could we carry on paying in even when we've come out?
Will the government consider making any contribution in any shape or form for access to the single market?
The major criterion here is that we get the best possible access for goods and services to the European market. And if that is included in what he's talking about, then of course we would consider it.
Interestingly, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, piled in. He was actually on a visit in Scotland and agreed with David Davis when he was speaking to journalists, almost like he was trying to bag this, cement in this idea. And it has been discussed, as I say, in private with business people, along with another idea, which is the idea that those sectors of the British economy bringing in low-skilled migrants, areas like agriculture and food processing, who are worried about labour shortages, he has been saying, David Davis, in private to business people, that he'll make sure they don't have anything to worry about. So there you are. Contributions could continue. Low-skilled migration could continue. Some Leave campaigners are a bit relaxed about that. Some are absolutely furious. Big if, Theresa May wants to go down this route, she's going to have to face down some people that until now she's looked like she was swimming pretty close to.
Gary Gibbon. Now, air quality alerts have been issued at bus stops, tube stations and roadsides across London because of high pollution. The move comes as a new report calls for changes to motoring rules and infrastructure to help reduce vehicle emissions and improve health. Fewer speed bumps, turning off car engines when waiting outside schools, and designing new roads in ways that keep pollution to a minimum are all included. But critics say the problem is not how we drive, but what we drive, and the new guidance won't do much about that. Our science editor Tom Clark reports.
13-year-old Philip Webb is on another day off school because of his asthma. It's so severe he's missing several days of school a month, not to mention playing real football with his real friends.
Do you feel it when there's bad pollution on the street? Can you feel it affecting your asthma?
Yeah, I can, because it just depends on the day. Like, I can walk down the street normally, be completely fine, but if there's a lot of cars, say like it's rush hour, I'll start to wheeze and I'll start to cough.
How does it feel to have that in your chest and your breathing?
Say like you've ever been punched in the chest, it feels like that constantly. You struggle for breath. It's like someone's also just wrapping a rope around your chest and pulling tighter and tighter.
Philip is taking part in a research project to see how much air pollution he's breathing as he walks to and from his school in East London.
So you carry with you wherever you go for 24 hours.
The pollution monitor he's carrying is linked to a smartphone that maps the bad air along his route.
The routes I would usually do is this way up towards my school, going up this road here. I did try to do is this road round here and up like that, but as you can see they all have red lines, meaning really high pollution.
Today's draft guidance from the National Institute for Care Excellence, or NICE, are an attempt to help people like Philip and millions of others most vulnerable to air pollution. It focuses on what local authorities can do to put air pollution at the heart of planning decisions, including big things like ensuring new roads don't force pollution on homes or pedestrians, and smaller ones like having no idling zones where engines must be switched off for school drop-off or deliveries. Even replacing speed bumps with other speed-restricting schemes that don't encourage unnecessary braking and accelerating. Smoother driving to reduce pollution won't be a hard sell, but tougher measures like congestion charging, now being looked at by many towns, are unlikely to go down quite so well.
I'm not sure that they will be unpopular with all drivers. I think most people are concerned about health, and the reality is that nitrogen dioxide is a toxic killer. It's known as the invisible killer. We know that around 25,000 people a year die where nitrogen dioxide is an attributable cause of those deaths. So it's about protecting the long-term health of our population. Ultimately, as elected politicians, we represent the views of our residents. So if our residents are saying there's something that needs to be done, then I'm sure people will listen and take notice.
Local authorities may be able to influence where and how we drive, but they can't change what we drive. And according to clean air campaigners and medical professionals, these guidelines represent a big missed opportunity because they fail to address air pollution at source. That's the lorries, the cars, the taxis and the buses that produce diesel pollution in the first place.
This is just tinkering around the edges. These are unlikely to make any major changes of exposure of the most vulnerable populations, such as children and old people. And what we need to really do is to reduce emissions from all roads, and that requires a national policy, not small local interventions.
Critics point out the current absence of any scheme that helps individuals and businesses to give up the most polluting diesel vehicles. So for now, people like Philip will have to rely on whatever small steps councils can take to manage the pollution and the ill health it causes.
Well, to Syria now, where the exodus of civilians from the besieged eastern side of the Syrian city of Aleppo continues. The United Nations now says that more than 30,000 people, mostly women and children, have fled the area. But there are increasing reports that men of fighting age among the evacuees are being detained by Syrian forces. Today, Amnesty International accused the United Nations Security Council of failing the Syrian people. We'll be talking to the head of Amnesty's UN office in a moment. But first, Matt Fry reports.
Russian soldiers welcoming the huddled masses from eastern Aleppo. Russia's state television showed these pictures this morning of recent arrivals from the district of Hanano in what used to be the rebel-held east.
The major part of eastern Aleppo was liberated. Not much is left. This area is growing at an exponential rate, which is why help is essential.
For a long time we wanted to leave, but they don't let us, and thank God you opened the route out for us.
The exodus from eastern Aleppo continues as more and more parts of the city fall to the regime. At least 30,000 have now fled, according to the UN. And the Russian and Syrian governments want you to believe that they're now in safe hands in camps like this. The district of Hanano was one of the first areas where the rebellion against the Assad regime began 5 years ago. This neighborhood used to be home to 250,000 people. It is now a wasteland and a no man's land, literally a land of no men. This was the fighting at the weekend, as Syrian troops helped by Shiite militiamen from Lebanon, Iraq and Afghanistan stormed Hanano. This is a sectarian battlefield. And the question that looms over these ruins with increasing urgency is this. Where have most of the Sunni men gone? A number of credible reports indicate that up to 500 men have been detained. The weekend onslaught by the regime shrank the rebel-held areas to around a third of their former territory. Now, Aleppo activists allege the regime has created 2 detention camps, one in Sukur district, the other in Jibrin, east of the international airport. The camps allegedly are for men aged between 18 and 40 years old who've been arrested in the captured areas. The UN has been sitting in emergency session while being accused by major aid organizations of inaction.
For the sake of humanity, we plead with the parties to protect civilians and enable access to the besieged part of eastern Aleppo before it becomes one giant graveyard.
The regime denies detaining anyone, but in previous cases, Syrian men of fighting age from rebel areas were held, never to be seen again. The worry is that the same is happening here, but on a much bigger scale. Could Aleppo become Syria's Srebrenica, but with the UN nowhere even in sight?
Well, over 200 humanitarian agencies around the world have condemned the United Nations for shameful inaction over Syria. In a joint declaration, the agencies are calling for an emergency session of the UN Assembly to demand an end to the war and immediate and unhindered humanitarian access to Aleppo and other areas affected by the conflict. Joining me now from New York is Shireen Tadros, head of Amnesty International's UN office. If the UN Assembly demanded an end to the war, the Syrian and Russian governments would ignore it. So what's the point?
Well, it's very sad that already we are got to the point 6 years later where we're still trying to ask the membership of the General Assembly to do something. But the fact is that there have been resolutions on the table of the Security Council that have not just sought an end to the war, but also sought accountability, which is incredibly important for the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed in this war. But these have been vetoed no less than 4 times by Russia and 3 times by China. So what we're calling for now is for the General Assembly to do what it can do, which is take the power from the Security Council and then act. And what it can do, the diplomatic tool that is at its disposal right now, is for it to call for an emergency special session on Syria and then for a Uniting for Peace resolution. This would send an incredibly strong message that the Security Council has failed Syria, but the General Assembly can still act. Is it the end game? No, it's absolutely not.
It would still just be words, wouldn't it?
Everything that happens at the UN. Say again?
It would just be words. It would be another talking shop resolution that doesn't do anything on the ground.
That's often the criticism with the United Nations, that it is a talking shop. But if you have a Uniting for Peace resolution that actually has very strong language to do with accountability, if it actually has the power to talk about collective action, then yes, it is a very strong message that most of the world is demanding action, and that if it continues to garner this sort of support, it can't be ignored. So we can either all sit back and say, well, the UN is a talking shop and there's nothing that can be done, or we can use every single tool that we have in order to escalate this, and that is what we're asking for. Even the UN ambassador, the US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, said yesterday that the GA needs to act. That's the US is a veto-wielding power in the Security Council. Even they are saying that the Security Council is failing and the General Assembly should pick this up.
What information do you have on this question of men in particular being detained coming out of East Aleppo at the moment? Do you know how many and what's happening to them?
It's very difficult, like it is for you, to get accurate information from the ground. We have been speaking to activists and to families that are in eastern Aleppo. We're very concerned about the thousands of fleeing, but we're actually also very concerned about the thousands that are staying, because we're hearing that in order for them to leave, they have to pass through government-controlled areas like in western Aleppo, and they're afraid of revenge attacks. And we've also heard, as Matt Fry was talking about, this increasing trend of taking men of fighting age and detaining them. We've heard that particularly in Mesek in Haneno, which is a neighborhood in eastern Aleppo. We have specific reports of this happening. It's very difficult to put a number on it. They're taken sometimes from their homes, they're taken to a nearby airport that's become a makeshift detention center, and they are interrogated. And don't forget that the Syrian government forces have a very dark and long history with torture, with arbitrary detention, with enforced disappearances. And again, we call on them to protect civilians, including from arbitrary detention and revenge attacks.
Shireen Tadros, thank you very much indeed.
When we come back, the first fruits of a Trump presidency, the president-elect travels to Indiana to celebrate saving 1,000 jobs that had been due to move to Mexico. Welcome back. Breaking news. Whilst we've been on air, the French socialist president, François Hollande, has made a shock announcement that he will not seek a second mandate. Despite overseeing a slight dip in unemployment, his approval ratings have been amongst the lowest of any post-war presidency, and his attempts to reform France's economy have been met with strike upon strike. Thatcherite François Fillon was elected as the Conservative candidate on Sunday, and it's expected he'll reach the runoff phase with the far-right's candidate Marine Le Pen next.
I have decided not to run as a candidate in the presidential election. I will not be renewing my mandate. I'm telling you this now at the beginning of December, having just come to the decision myself.
I'm joined now by our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, and of course that is because he can say, I'm not renewing my mandate, but I know the people won't renew it, so I might as well get there first.
Yes, it's an extraordinary admission of failure by François Hollande. He is the first French president since the Second World War not to run for re-election. It was an emotional performance on television this evening. He said he was going in the interests of unity for the French left. And I was talking to a Socialist Party spokeswoman earlier this week who said there were 4 or 5 candidates of the left and centre-left vying for the presidency, and they would get nowhere unless they found a unity candidate. As you said, Hollande extremely unpopular, one approval rating as low as 4%. Hollande had lunch on Monday with his Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, and his departure now clears the way for Valls, who cuts a bit like a Tony Blair figure from the Blair we knew of 20 years ago, a reformist-looking Labour leader. Valls will almost certainly run now in an attempt to be in this race at all on behalf of the Socialists, and not just leave it to this new right-wing candidate or to Marine Le Pen of the National Front.
Jonathan Rugman.
Now, in his first public appearance as president-elect, Donald Trump has stepped in to save the day at a manufacturing plant in the Midwest. He's done a deal to keep nearly 1,000 jobs in the US that were bound for Mexico. So how's he done it? Let's go to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris, who's in Indianapolis. Kylie.
Well, Krish, Donald Trump is due here shortly. He's just touring the plant, but yes, he's on a rescue mission. Even before he's reached the White House, his first act he wants to telegraph to the nation is that he's saved 1,000 jobs from going to Mexico. Already the headlines are being written, 1,000 happy families this Christmas in Indianapolis. And certainly some of the workers we spoke to expressed a real sense of relief. Were people worried about losing jobs?
Yeah, but I think we're going to be good.
Oh, hey, I'm thrilled. Right. I'm really glad to see them. I'm glad, things are working out for us, Everybody had made plans to get out of here, People were going to retire. And
does it prove he's a man of his word? Is that what matters here to you too?
This gets him started off on the right track.
Now, there were other workers we spoke to who were taking more of a wait-and-see approach. People want to know how this deal was done. Remember, Donald Trump, on his campaign, promised to penalise companies who took businesses offshore. Yet here we have a deal apparently that was struck on the back of a promise of tax cuts, corporate tax cuts. Not only that, $7 million worth of state government incentives, and also the prospect of the fact that, the parent company of Carrier in fact has nearly $7 billion worth of federal contracts. So certainly motivation there. Critics are warning of kind of showmanship. They say what matters here is the policies that Donald Trump actually enacts to ensure that this industry is resurrected nationwide. After all, just down the road from here, 2 hours down the road, there's another Carrier plant at Huntington. There, 700 jobs are about to be lost as that plant is closed and its business goes offshore. So the real test for Donald Trump is not to one by one singly save companies and individual jobs, but to prove that he can do this across America, which is indeed what he promised he would do to the people who voted him into office.
Kylie Morris in Indianapolis. Now, last week, the celebrated British photographer David Hamilton was found dead in Paris after taking his own life. A well-known French broadcaster had publicly accused him of raping her when she was just 13. And that prompted many of Hamilton's former models to allege that his crimes stretched back 40 years. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman has been talking to the first woman to break her silence. And I must warn you, this report contains distressing details of what happened to her.
Last Friday, the British photographer David Hamilton killed himself in this street in Paris, alone in this block of flats. He was 83. His books of photographs sold in their millions, and at the heart of his fame were his erotic pictures of nude women and young teenage girls. His work, he said, was in search of a lost paradise.
This man is not a genius.
What is he?
He is a pedophile. I don't know if you say it in English.
Paedophile, yes.
He's a pedophile. He raped a lot of little girls.
Ever since the 1960s, Hamilton divided his time between Paris and the pleasure beaches of the south of France. It was here that he recruited his models and where he met Flavie Flament, now 42 and a well-known French broadcaster.
I was 12 when I met David Hamilton in the south of France, and he saw me in a restaurant and he wanted to meet me, and he asked my mother, I just want to see your daughter in front of my camera. And we tried. He was very happy. He told me, you are the new one. And he asked me to come back next summer.
She did come back, and she claims Hamilton molested her every afternoon that he was taking photographs. Can you remember what happened on the first day?
I do. I remember the sky, because he wanted me to lay on the balcony, you know, and it was a sunny day. And I was looking at the sky and I wanted to jump and to go away. I didn't feel well, you know, and he came near me. He was nude. I was nude. And he come with his head in my legs, you know.
Between your legs?
Between my legs. And I was so afraid.
She says Hamilton took her to beaches, using her as his accomplice to find other girls, and that after a few days he raped her.
I remember there were a little window near the shower, and when he raped me I was looking at the window and I wanted to escape by the window, but I knew it wasn't possible. My spirit escaped this day. I only let him my body.
Your body.
And he gave me the towel and he told me, you know, it's like a butcher washing his hands, and he told me, be careful, your mother is coming.
Hamilton committed suicide in Paris last week, just a few weeks after Flament had gone public. He claimed he was innocent and that she was just looking for 15 minutes of fame by defaming him. But Flament's book, with Hamilton's photograph of her 13-year-old self on the cover, has prompted several alleged victims to come forward.
We received each day some calls of women crying and telling, I didn't dare to speak, but now he's not here to make me afraid, and I can say he did it to me.
Just before he died, Hamilton ate his last meal in this cafe at the end of his street, a sandwich with wine. The waitress told me he sat alone and he never smiled. Flament says 2 women did go to the police about Hamilton years ago, but he succeeded in dismissing them as nude models, not to be believed. But even if he'd lived, she couldn't bring charges herself, because French law prevents any prosecution for child rape once the victim is over 38 years old.
My lawyer told me, I am sorry, Flavie, it's too late for you. And I felt so... It was awful, because I was thinking, okay, so I was raped when I was 13. I don't sleep well. I'm not a happy woman. It's very difficult for me.
Hamilton's photographs are out of fashion now, many of them treading a dangerous line between pornography and art, while their author has taken his secrets and his alleged crimes to his grave.
I think that it's shameful to go like that and to turn his back to us. It's his justice, but not the justice in the eyes, not in front of all the people.
Not in court.
Not in court.
Yet memories of stolen childhoods, stretching back decades, are no longer condemned to silence, but flowing freely at last. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Paris.
Broadcaster Flavie Flamand talking to Jonathan Rugman.
After the break, it began as a stage show, then made a big impact on the small screen, and now it's returning to its roots. I talked to Phoebe Waller-Bridge about Fleabag and returning it to the stage. Now, it's this year's dark comedy, candid in its portrayal of female sexual experience. Fleabag, the character, is a dry-witted young woman who freely explores often taboo subjects. It started life in the theatre, then received critical acclaim as a TV series.
You know that feeling when a guy you like sends you a text at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday night asking if he can come and find you, and you've accidentally made it out like you've just got in yourself, so you have to get out of bed, drink half a bottle of wine, get in the shower, shave everything, dig out some agent provocateur business, suspend about the whole bit, and wait by the door until the buzzer goes. And then you open the door to him like you've almost forgotten he's coming over. Oh. Hi.
Well, now the writer and main character, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, has gone back to Fleabag's roots and is performing it again as a one-woman show. I went to meet her today.
5 o'clock, Northern Line. I'm trying to read an article about how apparently the word feminist has become dirty. I try to engage, but all it makes me think of is a bunch of dirty little feminists. I snort, laugh at myself, and then catch the eye of an attractive-looking man. Oh. Well, he's attractive when holding his paper to about here. It all gets a bit rodenty from the nose down, but good enough for some eye hockey on the tube. He smiles at me with his tiny mouth. I smile back. He looks down. I look down. And then we both look up at the same time. Little giggle. Other people on the carriage start to notice, charmed by the moment. It's revolting. It came at a time in my life when I was feeling quite inexplicably ragey, and I wanted to write a female character that was inexplicably ragey as well, where I feel like there's a lot of kind of angry young men characters out there that don't need to explain why they're angry, they're just allowed to be.
Ragey women or angry women are usually sort of written off or portrayed as just crazy.
Hysterical, yeah, or on their period.
But this is different.
Well, no, I probably think that, I think that it's the same, as in they're all the same, similar sort of stories. They come from the same, a woman being angry. I just refuse to allow it to be described as her being hysterical. I think it's a sort of latent anger that is, that's in this character, that she feels that she's a slave to her own need to be validated sexually a lot of the time, and that has made her, feel undervalued as a human being in other ways. At the end of the platform, sat on the sort of bench thing, is the drunkest girl I have ever seen. Head rolled forward, tit hanging out, bag sprawled. Nicely dressed, normal-looking girl who's clearly just had one hell of a night. I ask her where she needs to get off next. She says, London Bridge. Great. And then Kent. At one point we're walking, she just falls flat on her face. Boom, get her up, keep going. Her head's going all over the place. Try to keep her talking. After about 45 minutes, she turns to me and she says, "Ah, you're such a lovely man."
Do you think men get it, on the whole?
Yes, oh my gosh, yeah.
I read one interview in which you said, you look at the men looking sort of perplexed.
Oh, there's only like a couple of moments. A couple of moments in really idiosyncratically female moments, I think. There's a moment when Fleabag's boyfriend is stroking her head when she's sleeping and whispering, asking her where's she gone in the middle of the night. For some reason, the girls just get that. Even you look a bit
what's funny about that? I mean, sort of, I mean, there has been, in the last few years, Amy Schumer, Lena Dunham. Do you see this in that mould? I mean, it's quite different to Sex and the City.
Sex and the City was incredible in the way that it was both honest and it was aspirational and it was a fantasy. And actually, in the last few years, taking that pressure off it and saying this may not be aspirational, but it might be truthful, and actually being just being more candid about the experiences that women have without having to dress it up.
Some people don't really like it because they feel, well, why do you have to talk about sex and be sexy on camera and take your clothes off and all that kind of stuff? To do, are you doing this because you think it will help you sell the idea?
That's the thing. It's not sold through sex. It's a woman talking about her experience of sex, and it's a dark side. It's not something like she's just not flicking her hair around and showing her tits on the screen. It's about somebody actually discussing her experience, and I think that is not only valid but incredibly important now for women to be talking about that.
You've had a sort of a charmed career in many ways, you know, from RADA onwards. I mean, today, Andrew Lloyd Webber's foundation have put out a report saying there's a real crisis of diversity in acting. Yeah. And I mean, that must be something you see around you.
Yeah, like a lot of the voices that are being commissioned in the first place are often white middle class voices, often white male middle class voices. And I think it's not just about casting, although that's very important. It's about the stories that are being told. And I think that's really exciting that people are now starting to make a noise about that and actually starting to, you know, create work about people from different stories and different lives and different ethnicities. And
thank you very much. Very funny, Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
I thought it was very interesting.
Just before we go, surprised.
Well, just before we go, a reminder of that breaking news: François Hollande not running for a second term as president of France. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Bye-bye.